Every few decades or so, Minakami Village is required to carry out what they call the Crimson Sacrifice Ritual. This involves a pair of twins, where one strangles the other by the hellish abyss in order to release enough energy to sate it until the next ritual is required, and at the same time, reuniting their split souls into a single whole. But this isn't the only ritual that's carried out in Minakami, and should they need a stopgap before the Crimson Sacrifice is ready, they instead carry out something called the Shadow Ritual, or Hidden Ceremony. But what exactly is that? How do they go about it, and why is it necessary? Let's take a look. There are quite a few terms involved here, so first let's sort them out. The English versions of the game tend to use quite a few names for this ritual, whereas in Japanese it's simply called the Kage Matsuri. Kage, in this case, represents something hidden, or a shadow. And Matsuri, of course, means a festival. And so, depending on which game you're playing and which note you're reading, in English it might be referred to as the Hidden Ceremony, the Inner Ceremony, or the Shadow Ritual. This is made a little more confusing by the fact that Kage Matsuri is also a term to describe a minor festival that's held on the off years of bigger festivals. This also exists in the game, and while it used to take place in the villages surrounding Minakami while the actual Crimson Sacrifice ritual was being held, even after Minakami disappeared, it continued. Mio and Mayu even attended it several times when they were younger. This festival, being a mere imitation of the real Crimson Sacrifice ritual in Minakami, involved releasing lanterns into the sky so they would look like butterflies. And thankfully, no actual sacrificing took place. In any case, to keep things straight, I'll refer to the Minakami ritual as the Shadow Ritual throughout this video. This ritual is actually fairly straightforward. Because the Crimson Sacrifice ritual is only required to be held once every few decades or so, the Shadow Ritual exists as a much smaller and easier to carry out temporary measure should the abyss start rumbling in the meantime. It's much easier and quicker to carry out because it's not meant to stop the abyss, just calm it for a short while. The main portion of this ritual is also referred to as the Cutting Ritual. That should give you some idea of what happens here. Interestingly, in Japanese it's called the Misogi no Gishiki. This uses the kanji for body and shave or plane, but Misogi is also the term for Shinto purification ceremonies, so there's a little hidden meaning in it as well that doesn't quite come across in English. You can also see this with the shide hanging from the ropes used in the ritual, signifying that this is likely shimenawa as well, a sort of rope used to designate a sacred Shinto space. The very first person to go through with this misogi, or cutting ritual, was a high priest from the village. He carved up his own body, enduring incredible pain, and through this, he was able to mummify himself. The act of Sokushinbutsu. This was a very real tradition, believed to have taken place around what is now Yamagata Prefecture in Japan's northeast. Over a period of roughly 10 years, monks would eat a strict diet of food gathered only from mountain forests in an attempt to eliminate all fat from the body. Then they would slowly reduce liquid intake as well, eventually dehydrating the body, and, if successful, dying while in meditation, and leaving behind a mummified body that would not require any sort of artificial preservative to maintain it. This entire process was viewed as an act of enlightenment, and the mummies were highly venerated. And so the idea here was somewhat similar, although on a much faster and painful scale. Minakami's high priest of the time, looking for some way to calm the abyss, knew that it required an incredible amount of energy. This energy is generally found through pain, like the physical and emotional pain tied to killing one's other half. But what if there were no twins available? Or a ritual as large as the Crimson Sacrifice wasn't necessary at that precise moment? Well, seems the High Priest decided to do a little test, using himself as the subject. He carved himself up, enduring absolutely incredible pain, and then his mummified body was, presumably, thrown into the abyss so that energy could sate it for the time being. And it worked. A ritual was born. The villagers called this person who took part in the cutting ritual a kusabi, or a wedge, and whenever they needed a smaller scale ritual, they carried it out. Now, it appears that later high priests were a little less self-sacrificial than this one was, because later kusabis weren't priests, but rather outsiders. Again, by taking a look at the Japanese term, we can gain a little more insight into this. While the English simply refers to them as outsiders, the Japanese calls them marebito. You've probably heard of the Shimizu Takashi movie of the same name, and this is the same word, although it uses different kanji. A marebito is a visitor from afar, but it also has a second meaning, and that is of a divine being that visits our world from the other side. These marebito, or divine beings from afar, might bring rare gifts with them, such as wisdom and knowledge, or perhaps straight up happiness. And who doesn't want a bit of that? By treating these guests from outside your tiny little world well, they may impart such treasures upon you. And this is why guests are so highly revered, even today. It's a little similar in a way to the "customer is God" saying we have in English. But here, well, the guest is a god. Perhaps literally. So, if we're trying to calm a literal gate to hell, and the usual ritual involves sacrificing one half of a pair of twins, and remember, these twins are considered to be divine in Minakami, then who makes for a good option for this temporary shadow ritual? Who else is also divine? Why, marebito, guests, outsiders from afar. It's not hard to see why the villagers would quickly settle for using outsiders to torture, carve up, then toss into hell. The Minakami villagers would probably get on well with the phrase, huh? Guest rights need not apply here. And so, if a shadow ritual was necessary, a guest to the village would be warmly welcomed before being confined to a cell in the Kurosawa house. Then the ceremony master and his priests would carry out the cutting ritual in the nearby rope temple. Here, the outsider, or kusabi, would be tied up, and the priests would chant as they cut him with their staves. The more pain he suffered, the greater his sacrifice would be. So naturally, this wasn't a pleasant ceremony, and in fact, it often failed. The kusabi still had to survive this ritual, so it was a fine line they had to walk. If the kusabi didn't survive, then his remains would be placed in the underground passageway leading down to the abyss, and presumably another sacrifice would have to be found. If he did survive, then the priests would carry him down to the abyss and toss him in, ropes and all, while he was still alive. And the more pain he suffered, the greater his sacrifice would be, helping to keep the abyss calm until a proper Crimson Sacrifice ritual could be carried out. It should also be noted that this cutting ritual was so brutal that many kusabi often lost limbs. In some cases, the limbs might simply be tied against the body with the same ropes that were used to hold them up, as we saw with the final kusabi, Makabe Seijiro. But the villagers also created a burial mound behind the Minakami cemetery, where they enshrined some of these body parts as well. They called this location the Umbral Mound. Again, the Japanese for this location uses the same kanji for kage, meaning hidden or shadow. And it was hoped that by enshrining what was left of their remains, their angry spirits would be, well, less angry. I'm not sure that worked out so well for them, but hey, an attempt was made. Interestingly, it appears that this shadow ritual wasn't limited to just one outsider at a time either. In his diaries, Tachibana Itsuki mentions that he fears his friend Munakata Ryozo and Ryozo's mentor, Makabe Seijiro, are both going to be turned into kusabis. His fears were correct, and while they were able to get Ryozo out of the village in time, Makabe himself chose to stay, even knowing what would happen to him, because his desire to see the hellish abyss was simply too great. He was the last successful kusabi sacrifice to take part in the shadow ritual, and his sacrifice kept the abyss calm long enough for the village to get ready for its next Crimson Sacrifice ritual. Of course, as we now know, that one still went horribly wrong, and so, when the repentance struck, he was one of the first spirits to rise from the abyss, alongside Sae, the twin whose ritual failed. Together, they swept over the village, killing any and all in their path. Makabe's vengeful spirit was especially violent, cutting and slashing his victims in the same way he himself had been tortured before death. We also run into another kusabi in Fatal Frame 3. Kei encounters him in the Manor of Sleep, and the spirit list tells us this guy was also an outsider who wandered into Minakami and was then sacrificed. He ends up in the Manor of Sleep thanks to Mio's nightmare, pulling parts of Minakami village into it. This guy appears to still have all of his limbs attached, so he was perhaps one of the, lucky ones. And that is some of the lore, real life and otherwise, behind the shadow and cutting rituals carried out in Minakami village. But what did you guys think of this one? Are there any other bits of Fatal Frame lore you'd like to see me cover? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you again next time.